The charity 10K had been Marcus Webb's idea from the start, which was the sort of detail people forgot once the story got told and retold, because by the time it reached its ending, nobody wanted to remember that Marcus Webb had been the villain of his own event. He was 44 years old, the founder and CEO of a logistics software company called Farawatt Systems, worth an amount of money that had stopped feeling real to him around his second acquisition, and he had built his entire public identity on a single word: winning. He said it in interviews. He said it in the company all-hands meetings that his employees dreaded twice a year. He had it, reportedly, engraved on the inside of his wedding ring, which told you most of what you needed to know about the marriage that had ended 4 years earlier. The race was called the Liberty Run, and it benefited a Veterans Transition Foundation in Colorado Springs, and Marcus had agreed to be the headline sponsor because his PR team told him it would soften an image that had grown sharp edges over a decade of aggressive acquisitions and 3 separate lawsuits from former employees. He did not care about veterans particularly. He cared about the photograph of himself crossing a finish line in athletic gear, looking like a man who did not need to buy his health the way he bought everything else. He had not counted on Elena Ruiz. Elena was 36, a former Army combat medic who had done 2 tours in Afghanistan before an Eid outside Kandahar took her right leg below the knee and put 4 pieces of shrapnel in her hip that she still carried, because removing them risked more nerve damage than leaving them. She had spent 3 years learning to run again on a carbon fiber blade prosthetic. And she had spent the 2 years after that training seriously, not for medals, but because running had become the only thing that made the ringing in her ears go quiet. She had signed up for the Liberty Run the way she signed up for most things, quietly, without announcement, because she did not consider what she did remarkable. She simply intended to finish. Marcus met her 3 days before the race at the sponsor breakfast, where the foundation had arranged for a handful of participating veterans to shake hands with donors for photographs. He looked at her prosthetic leg the way certain men look at anything they have decided, in advance, to underestimate. He said, in front of 2 board members and a foundation director named Colonel Grant Whitfield, "You're running the full 10K? On that?" Elena said, "That's the plan." Marcus, who had 2 bourbons in him and an audience he could not resist performing for, said, "I'll tell you what, $5 million to the foundation if you finish. And if you don't," he smiled, the way men smile when they think a joke excuses cruelty, "the foundation gets nothing. And you can explain to everybody here why you signed up for something you couldn't do." The room went quiet in the specific way rooms go quiet when someone has said a thing that cannot be unsaid. Colonel Whitfield started to intervene, but Elena raised a hand, calm, and said, "Put it in writing." Marcus, delighted, thinking he had found free publicity and a guaranteed non-payment, had his assistant draft the terms that afternoon. $5 million contingent on Elena Ruiz completing the full 10K course under the standard 4-hour cutoff, verified by race timing chips and photo finish. If she did not finish, the foundation received the standard sponsorship amount only, $200,000 already committed regardless. He signed it in front of a photographer, because Marcus Webb never did anything without a photographer. What Marcus did not know, because he had not asked, and would not have listened if told, was that Elena Ruiz had run a marathon 11 months earlier. Not a 10K. A full 26.2 miles, at altitude, in Leadville, Colorado, one of the hardest courses in the country. And she had finished it in 4 hours and 11 minutes, which was itself a case study taught now at a prosthetics research lab at the University of Colorado for what it demonstrated about gait efficiency on transtibial blades. A 10K for Elena Ruiz was not a question of weather. It was a question of margin. She also did not know, because she had not thought to ask, that Marcus's $5 million was not entirely his to lose so casually. Farawat Systems was 11 days from closing an acquisition of a mid-size fleet tracking competitor, and the due diligence team from the acquiring bank had specifically flagged Marcus's public conduct as a reputational risk variable in the deal. The kind of clause that exists in contracts precisely because bankers have learned that men like Marcus eventually do something in public that becomes a liability in private. The morning of the race was cold and clear, the kind of Colorado morning where the mountains look closer than they are. 400 runners gathered at the start line outside the Air Force Academy grounds. A marching band from a local high school playing something patriotic and slightly out of tune, and Marcus Webb stood near the front in a personally monogrammed windbreaker, doing interviews about his generosity. Elena stood near the back, near the veterans' block, in a plain gray shirt with her unit's insignia on the sleeve, saying almost nothing to anyone. The gun went off at 8 a.m. For the first 3 miles, nothing about the race was remarkable. Marcus ran near the front of the recreational pack, comfortable, performing effort for the cameras positioned at the 2-mile mark. Elena settled into a pace so even it looked almost mechanical, the blade striking the pavement with a rhythm that had taken her 3 years of humiliating, repetitive practice to build, and that now looked, to anyone watching closely, like something closer to music than motion. By mile 5, Marcus had slowed. He was 44, and his cardiovascular fitness was the kind purchased through a personal trainer twice a week rather than earned through anything sustained, and the altitude was doing what altitude does to men who have not trained for it. He did not notice Elena pass him. He was busy negotiating with his own lungs. By mile 7, a small cluster of spectators near a water station had begun to notice the woman running with the blade and had begun, without organizing it, to cheer specifically for her. Not out of pity, which she would have hated, but because the rhythm of her stride had a kind of inevitability to it that made people want to watch it continue. At mile 8, a local news crew that had been assigned to cover Marcus's celebrity sponsorship found themselves, instead, filming Elena. Marcus finished the race in 1 hour 58 minutes, in the middle of the recreational pack, sweating through the monogrammed windbreaker, already composing in his head the story he would tell about narrowly making his own deadline. Elena Ruiz crossed the finish line in 1 hour 31 minutes, 27 minutes ahead of the man who had bet against her. She was smiling when she crossed, and it was this detail, captured by 3 separate cameras, replayed later on 2 morning shows, that people found themselves unable to stop watching, because it was not the smile of someone who had proven a point. It was the smile of someone who had simply been doing, competently and without much drama, the thing she had already known she could do. Marcus found her afterward near the medical tent, where she was drinking water and talking with Colonel Whitfield. He said, attempting the tone of a man who enjoys being wrong, "You didn't tell me you'd run a marathon." Elena said, "You didn't ask." He said, "Why were you smiling at the finish? You looked like you already knew." Elena set down her water. She said, "Because I wasn't running against you. I was never running against you. You made this about a bet, but I signed up for this race before I ever met you, for people who don't have $5 million riding on whether they finish, and who finish anyway. Because finishing is the only thing that ever mattered to any of us over there. You bet against a story that was already written. I just had to run it." Marcus paid the $5 million. Because the contract was public and the photographer had documented the signing and, more practically, because his acquiring bank's legal team had already begun asking questions about the wager before the race had even finished. And a public reversal would have cost him considerably more than money. The foundation used the funds to open a prosthetics and mobility training center attached to the transition program, named, over Elena's objections, which were overruled unanimously by the board, the Ruiz Center for Adaptive Athletics. Elena did not attend the ribbon cutting for the wing that bore her name. She was, by then, 3 weeks into training another veteran, a 24-year-old former infantryman who had lost both legs above the knee and who did not yet believe he would run again, and who needed, more than a plaque or a headline, someone sitting next to him at 6 in the morning, telling him that the thing that felt impossible was in fact only difficult, and that difficult had a shape you could learn. She told him what she had told Marcus Webb, though she used fewer words with him, because he needed fewer words and more mornings. She told him finishing was never the hard part. Finishing was just what happened once you stopped needing anyone else to believe you could.